Hey all, in the last post that we did on Ruby, we looked at how to get user input, and obviously getting user input meant that we had to store that input somewhere. So here was the posting, getting and using user input, and we started to actually use variables. So I thought it would be useful to look at the different types of variables that Ruby could provide to us, because obviously we're only using a simple type here. Now let's just open up a command prompt and we'll go into interactive Ruby. So let's just set up some simple variables. So we have a type of a string, and that could be pretty much anything, right? Any collection of characters. We have a type of integer, in which case we don't need quotes around it because it's a number, not a string. And we have a type called float, and float is similar to an integer, except it has some floating points on it, and decimal places, let's call them. Okay, interesting. I didn't know that IRB just returned. Maybe it's because it's 00. In fact, let's try that. Let's change float. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that must be why. So in Ruby, we're going to declare variables, and those variables will have a specific kind of type. And in here we're saying it's a string, an integer, or a float. And obviously, I'm sure it's obvious, but just to make sure it's absolutely clear, integer has no fractional or decimal component to it, whereas the floating point numbers clearly do, and that's why we've got these two. For some reason, very early on in programming, this confused the bejesus out of me, but it's as simple as that. Now, in setting up these three variables, we've actually done quite a lot. Obviously, we've declared a variable by designating its name, string, integer, float, and assigning a value. So we've got assignment going on here, and here are the values. In assigning these values, we're using one of the many operators. So here we're just using the equals operator. But just like in maths, there is a large set of operators which all have precedence, as in maths, but that definitely warrants a separate look at them, because getting that precedence correct and using the correct the correct operators is obviously pretty critical if you want to get your script right. Now, unlike other programming languages, such as Java, for example, in Ruby, we can be very flexible with the way that we declare our variables. So, Java requires us to declare the variable and then define the variable type in very specific terms at the same time, but it's not so in Ruby. So Ruby uses this technique referred to as duck typing, correctly dynamic typing, and this typing is not keyboard typing as the name kind of suggests to me when I hear it ring around my head, but it's a particular type. So is it a float, is it an integer, or is it a string? And Ruby will dynamically type it based on what you enter. So when I put this value with quotes around it, Ruby's saying that to me looks like a string. And when I put a number in With no floating points, it will say it looks like an integer, and with floating points, it looks like a float. And we can actually check that. So there are a number of classes in Ruby that will allow us to use some of the methods that were available in those classes, on whatever it is we're working with. So here's an example. We can say string, and then we call a method by putting a point. Let me just move that out of the way. And we can say it's a kind of what? A kind of string. Now we know, because we've called it this way, string is certainly a string. So this should come up true. Indeed it does. And obviously we can then say, well, okay, is it one of the others? One of the other types? Well, no, it's not. If we change that to check integer, is integer a kind of integer? Yes, it is. What about that being a float then? Well, no, it's not. Great. So we've not had to declare the type. Ruby has gone, I get what you've put in there, I'll work with it. So I think those methods actually come from the object class. But we've actually got, there's 3 classes of importance: the object, fixed num, and string. Big num you could have a look at as well, and I'll put some links in the blog. Now, if you wanted to work with this data, let's say you were getting this data from a user putting data in through a UI. It may be that you want to work with this data in some different way. So for example, you get this floating number or you get the integer, and you want to work with it in reverse. The integers as floats, floats as integers, etc. What you can do then is you could say, let's have a look. So we have float, and we put 2, a integer. So here we go. So float, which we know has got 0.01 on the end, has now actually been shown to us just as what looks like an integer. So we've gone float, called a method called toInteger. Now the question is, have we essentially broken our data? Have we polluted the data by changing this back? So I think in IRB we can just put float, and in fact no, we've not. So where Ruby would have allowed you just to declare float as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then Ruby would, so obviously with an assignment operator, and Ruby would understand that you now want float in fact to be an integer, no decimal places. You're breaking the data, and it's quite a, maybe sometimes you want to do that, right? But it's quite a sort of heavy-handed way of doing it. And if you're just working with data, then there are ways to work with it. And these methods, again, live in the particular classes that I've been mentioning. So, a good example I saw of that actually. Let's get rid of this. Let me just give you one more example just to sort of bring it home. If you had, let's say, a user entering, well, their age, my age, equals 32 years. What you might want is just a number. You just want 32, and they've gone merrily along and typed 32 years. And it's obviously a string, right? So if we were to do, my age kind of string, it would come back true. But what we want now is just to say, well, hang on. When I use this data, I actually want it just to be an integer. I think that's correct. And here we go. So it pulls the number back and ignores both the space and the characters. So again, these seem fairly innocuous, but actually I'm sure that, you know, there's a good example of how these can be quite powerful. We've not changed the data, we've changed the way that we're working with the data. And again, there's no problem, you know, assigning this to another variable and saying, you know, true or correctly formatted age is my age to an integer. So that's just a quick look. I just wanted to run through those three main types of variable and the idea of Ruby being dynamically typed. But though it's dynamically typed, don't just go wading in, changing, you know, the type of data that you're putting in there. Ruby will roll along happily with it, but in terms of, you know, cleanliness of data, cleanliness of your scripting, if something is meant to be afloat, keep it afloat. And if you need to work with it in some different way, have a look at the Ruby docs for object, fixed num string, etc. And look at, you know, to I, to F, to S, and we'll come on to different ways again to manipulate data, you know, to maybe parse out data like this. But try and use clever programming and not sort of brute force. Okay, that's a quick intro to the three main types of variables that you'll just use, you know, straight away in day to day. There are some different categories of variables, and they are, you know, global, local, instance, and we have these things called constants. And those categories have different scopes. So if you think about your program and, you know, how your program's constructed, what it can interact with, that is the kind of scope. And here we're just looking at very simple local variables, and we can have a look then at you know, instance variables and global variables. Okay, that is that one.